Welcome back to Mythical Boring History. It is late. The world outside is hopefully quiet, and you are here for a story that has been told in various forms for a few thousand years. The lights are low, and history is waiting. Take a breath, settle into your blankets, and let the weight of the day start to lift. We aren't in any rush tonight. Tonight, we are traveling back to a time when the world felt much smaller, yet the sky felt much heavier. We're looking at the Greek Bronze Age, or at least the memory of it, when a king named Lycaon made a choice so poor that it allegedly convinced Zeus to drown the entire planet. We'll follow the rain as it falls on the marble of early Greece, watch how the Romans later repurposed the tragedy for their own propaganda, and see how even the Vikings and Egyptians had their own versions of a world that simply needed a bath. We will witness the slow rot of the Silver Age, the desperate logistics of a wooden ark, and eventually the quiet realization that humanity is much harder to get rid of than the gods anticipated. It all leads to a single strange question about why we tell these stories in the first place, one I'll answer at the very end. The challenge, as it usually is with the Olympians, was a matter of hospitality, or rather the lack of it. It's a recurring irony in ancient history that the most powerful empires often fall because of a dinner party gone wrong. But was the flood a divine judgment, or just a convenient way for a failing civilization to explain a change in climate? Stay until the end, because the final reveal explains how this empire actually broke. You'll see how one small mistake triggered a chain reaction no army could stop. There's a moment historians still argue about because it's genuinely strange. And once the gods get dragged into the war stories, things get even weirder. In the final minutes, I'll connect this collapse to a lesson that still applies today. And if you enjoy calm, sleepy history told like a bedtime story, subscribe to Mythical Boring History. Tap like, drop a comment with your favorite ancient civilization, and share this video with someone who needs sleep and strange old history. Let's start in Arcadia. It's a rugged, mountainous place in the Peloponnese, and back then it was ruled by Lycaon. Now, Lycaon had 50 sons, which is a lot of palace politics for one house to handle. This was the Silver Age, a period that Greek poets like Hesiod described as being a bit of a downgrade from the Golden Age. People were living longer, but they weren't necessarily getting any smarter. They were, according to the myths, becoming arrogant. They stopped burning the right parts of the sheep for the gods, which is usually the first sign of a Bronze Age recession. Zeus, sitting up on Olympus, was hearing rumors, the kind of rumors a CEO hears about a branch office that stopped following corporate policy. He decided to head down to Earth, disguised as a common traveler, to see if the humans were actually as bad as the reports suggested. He ended up at the palace of Lycaon. Now, Lycaon wasn't sure if this traveler was a god or just a very dusty man, so he decided to test him. His method of testing was not his best idea. He decided to serve a meal that was strictly against the rules of both gods and decent catering. He didn't just break the laws of hospitality, he shattered them. Zeus, who generally preferred his sacrifices to be of bovine variety, was not impressed. Historians debate whether Lycaon was a symbol of the transition from human sacrifice to animal sacrifice, or if he was just a convenient villain for a story about why the old world had to end. Regardless, Zeus didn't just leave a bad review. He flipped the table, turned Lycaon into a wolf, hence the word lycanthropy, and headed back to the clouds with a very dark plan. He didn't want to use his thunderbolts. That was too messy, and he was worried the heat might set the heavens on fire, which would be an administrative nightmare. No, he wanted something cleaner, something that would wash the slate. He called up Boreas, the north wind, and told him to stay put while he let Notus, the south wind, loose. This matters later because the winds were the logistics of the ancient world. If the wind isn't blowing the right way, your navy is useless, your crops don't get pollinated, and your gods are clearly in a bad mood. The clouds began to gather, thick and heavy, hanging over the marble temples of the early Greeks like a wet wool blanket. It wasn't a sudden burst, it was a slow, rhythmic drumming on the roof tiles. The people in the markets probably thought it was just a passing storm. They likely went about their business, complaining about the mud and the price of grain, unaware that the king of the gods had already decided their era was over. And while everyone pretended this was normal, the water in the rivers began to rise, inching toward the foundations of the great halls. As the rains shifted from a nuisance to a catastrophe, the geography of Greece began to change. If you've ever seen the Peloponnese, it's a place of sharp limestone peaks and deep, hidden valleys. It's beautiful, but as the water rose, those valleys became traps. The myths tell us that Zeus didn't just open the clouds, he called up his brother Poseidon and told him to let the rivers break their banks. Imagine the sheer logistical nightmare of a world where the roads literally liquefy. In the middle of this divine cleaning project, we find Deucalion and his wife, Pyrrha. Deucalion was the son of Prometheus, the Titan who famously stole fire and had a very complicated relationship with the concept of authority. Prometheus, being a Titan with a bit of foresight, had warned his son that a damp season was coming. While the rest of the Silver Age elites were busy arguing over land taxes and temple influence, Deucalion was building a chest, not a ship with a hull and a rudder, but a large, sturdy wooden box. It wasn't a particularly grand vessel. There were no gilded oars or purple sails. It was a survival pod, built with the kind of grim efficiency you only see when someone truly believes the sky is falling. Deucalion and Pyrrha climbed inside, packed some supplies, the ancient equivalent of canned goods and dry blankets, and waited. Historians often look at this and wonder about the actual flooding of the Mediterranean basin. There are theories about the Black Sea deluge or localized tsunamis that felt like the end of the world to a Bronze Age farmer. But to Deucalion, the why mattered a lot less than the how. How do you stay dry when the horizon has disappeared? The water didn't just cover the fields, it climbed the marble steps of the palaces. It swirled around the statues of the very gods who were sending it. The snarky reality here is that the gods were essentially destroying their own fan clubs. Without humans to offer sacrifices and build monuments, Olympus was going to get very quiet and very hungry. But Zeus was a big picture kind of leader, which usually means he didn't think about the long-term consequences of his temper tantrums until the bill came due. For 9 days and 9 nights, the chest bobbed on the surface of a shoreless sea. There's a certain quiet horror in that. The sound of rain on wood, the lack of any bird calls, the absolute silence of a world that had been very loud just a week prior. Deucalion and Pyrrha were the only ones left to hear it, or so they thought. Elsewhere in the world, other cultures were dealing with their own versions of this. The Egyptians, who lived and died by the flooding of the Nile, viewed water differently. For them, the flood wasn't an end, it was a beginning. But even their records speak of the Great Return, a time when the waters of Nun threatened to swallow the sun. Back in the Greek version, the chest eventually bumped into something solid. It wasn't the shore, it was the peak of Mount Parnassus. The water was so high that only the very tips of the world were sticking out, like small islands in a soup. As the rain finally began to taper off, Deucalion stepped out into a world that was recognizable. It was gray, muddy, and completely empty. But that isn't the weirdest part. The challenge wasn't just surviving the flood, it was what came next. How do you restart a civilization with 2 people and a muddy mountain? Zeus, realizing he might have overcorrected, sent Hermes down to see if Deucalion had any requests. Hermes didn't ask for gold or power, he asked for people. This decision would age very badly for the next few generations, but at the time it seemed like the only logical move. Hermes gave them a cryptic instruction: veil your heads and throw the bones of your mother behind you. Now Pyrrha was horrified because she thought this meant literal grave robbing, but Deucalion, being the son of a Titan, realized the mother was Gaia, the earth, and her bones were the stones on the ground.
The stones Deucalion threw became men, and the stones Pyrrha threw became women. It's a bit of a literal take on hard-headedness, but it gave the new world its workforce. This was the start of the Bronze Age, or at least the reboot. They were a harder race of people, born from the bones of the earth, presumably better suited for the manual labor of rebuilding a drowned planet. But as the mud dried and the survivors moved down from the peaks of Parnassus, they found that the world wasn't quite the blank slate Zeus had intended. The water had receded, but it had left behind a thick layer of silt, salt, and the ruins of 1,000 years of Silver Age mistakes. The transition from the flood to a functioning society wasn't a montage. It was a slow, agonizing process of clearing debris and figuring out where the old property lines used to be. Records from this period are, as you can imagine, non-existent, but the oral traditions suggest that the first thing these stone people did was build a temple. They were remarkably quick to forgive the god who had just tried to erase them, which was probably more about survival than genuine affection. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the family tree, Zeus was realizing that the flood hadn't actually solved the problem of human nature. He had replaced the soft, arrogant people of the Silver Age with a harder, more warlike variety. It's a bit of a recurring theme in divine management. The solution often creates a more efficient version of the original problem. The new humans were tough, they were resilient, and they were very good at making bronze weapons. As they began to build cities like Mycenae and Tyrants, they weren't just building for comfort, they were building for defense. These Cyclopean walls, named because later Greeks couldn't believe humans had moved such massive stones, are a testament to a generation that didn't trust the horizon. They had seen the water rise, and they weren't taking any chances. But that isn't the weirdest part. While the Greeks were throwing stones and building walls, the memory of the flood was drifting across the sea. In the Roman version of the story, told much later by Ovid, the focus shifts. The Romans, being the logistical masters they were, focused less on the magic and more on the sheer scale of the environmental disaster. They describe the dolphins swimming through the tops of oak trees and the wolves struggling to stay afloat alongside the sheep. It was a vision of a world where the natural order had been completely inverted. For the Romans, this wasn't just a myth, it was a cautionary tale about Pax Deorum, the peace of the gods. If the state didn't maintain its religious duties, the environment itself would turn into a weapon. They saw the flood not as an ancient event, but as a looming possibility if the bureaucracy of worship ever faltered. The records get strangely quiet here regarding the immediate descendants of Deucalion. We hear about his son, Hellen, who supposedly gave his name to the Hellenes, the Greeks, but the actual day-to-day reality of living in a post-flood landscape was likely much grimmer than the poets let on. There were no more Golden Age fruits growing of their own accord. Agriculture had to be reinvented. The relationship with the gods had changed from one of communal living to one of transaction. You give the gods a goat, and they promise not to drown you. It was a cold, hard bargain.
This decision to restart with stony humans will age very badly when we get to the Trojan War, but for now, the world was quiet. The cities were growing, the trade routes were reopening, and the heavy clouds had finally fully dispersed. But the trauma was baked into the architecture. Every high citadel and every mountaintop shrine was a reminder the gods are powerful, they are temperamental, and they have a very low threshold for a bad dinner party.
While the Greek world was busy literalizing the concept of starting from scratch, the Egyptians were watching the same horizon with a very different set of anxieties. It's worth drifting over to the Nile for a moment, because their perspective on the Great Flood wasn't about a vengeful sky god with a grudge. It was about the very nature of existence. In Egyptian cosmology, the world emerged from Noon, the primordial waters of chaos. For them, a flood wasn't a punishment, it was a return to the factory settings. The Egyptians were the masters of water management. Their entire civilization was essentially a giant logistics project based on the predictable tantrums of the Nile. But there were times, recorded in the darker corners of their history, when the inundation didn't just nourish the fields, it threatened to erase the temples. Historians debate whether the myths of the lioness of the desert were actually coded memories of a catastrophic flood. The story goes that Ra, the sun god, became disillusioned with humanity. Much like Zeus, he felt the people were plotting against him. He sent the goddess Sekhmet to deal with the problem. She didn't use rain, she was the heat of the sun and the fury of the desert. But the result was the same, a world that was being systematically emptied. To save what was left of humanity, the gods didn't build an ark. Instead, they used beer. They dyed it red to look like blood, flooded the fields with it, and waited for the goddess to drink herself into a peaceful slumber. This matters later because it shows two very different ways of dealing with a crisis. The Greeks built a box and hoped for the best. The Egyptians used a massive state-sponsored distraction. One was about isolation, the other was about management. But both cultures shared the same bone-deep fear that the world was fragile. Back in Greece, the stone people were starting to encounter the practical problems of their own resilience. They were tough, yes, but they were also stubborn. The unity that had been forged on the peaks of Parnassus was beginning to crack as the water levels dropped further and more land became available. If you have 50 sons of a king and a whole new world to divide, you're going to have some very long, very tense dinners. The records get strangely quiet about the internal politics of Deucalion's immediate household, but we can guess the vibe. It was likely a mixture of survivors' guilt and intense land grabbing. Every hill that emerged from the mud was a potential kingdom. Every spring that cleared was a source of power. The transition from a flooded wasteland to a collection of warring city-states was beginning, and the gods were watching with the kind of detached interest a scientist has for a Petri dish. And while everyone pretended this was a fresh start, the old habits were creeping back. The corruption hadn't been washed away, it had just been diluted. The Silver Age was gone, but the Bronze Age was proving to be much more violent. The internal rot wasn't in the system yet, it was in the hearts of the people who had been born from the earth itself. They felt they owed the world nothing because they had quite literally been made from its debris. This decision to focus on expansion rather than stability is what eventually triggers the first great wars of the new era. But that isn't the weirdest part. As the survivors moved further inland, they began to find things that the flood hadn't quite managed to bury, relics of the world that Zeus had tried to delete. While the Greek survivors were navigating the mud of the Peloponnese, a much colder version of this catastrophe was being whispered about in the north. It's worth drifting up to the fjords for a moment. In the Viking tradition, the world wasn't drowned by rain sent from a disgruntled sky father. It was drowned by blood. When Odin and his brothers decided to end the reign of the primordial giant Ymir, they didn't just strike him down.
His wounds created a tidal wave of such immense proportions that it wiped out almost the entire race of frost giants. Historians debate whether these stories across such different climates share a common root, perhaps a global memory of rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age, or if humanity just has a natural tendency to imagine the world ending in a giant bath. For the Vikings, the survivor wasn't a man in a wooden chest named Deucalion. It was a giant named Bergelmir. He and his wife climbed into a hollowed-out tree trunk, or perhaps a grinding mill, and bobbed along the surface of the blooded sea until a new world could be shaped from the wreckage. This matters later because it changes how a civilization views its own foundation. The Greeks saw themselves as being made of the earth's bones, hard, resilient, and enduring. The Vikings saw their world as being built from the literal corpse of a giant. It's a bit of a darker start to a workday, knowing your mountains are teeth and your trees are hair. Back in the Mediterranean, the stone people were finding that the geography of Greece had been permanently altered. The flood had carved out new rivers and buried old ones. This was a nightmare for the early cartographers, or at least the people who tried to remember where the best fishing spots were. The internal rot of the previous age was gone, but in its place was a vacuum of power. As the water receded from the lower plains, the descendants of Deucalion, like his son Helen, began to formalize their control. They weren't just farmers anymore. They were kings of the mud. They began to build the first great citadels, and they did so with a specific kind of paranoia. If you've ever seen the ruins of Tiryns, the walls are so thick they seem designed to hold back the ocean itself, even though the sea is miles away. But that isn't the weirdest part. As they dug the foundations for these new cities, they started finding things. Ancient, waterlogged statues of the Silver Age gods, broken jewelry, the remnants of the very luxury that had caused Zeus to flip the table in the first place. Instead of throwing these things away, the new humans began to hoard them. They were obsessed with the Great Before, even though the Great Before was a disaster. This decision to build a new world on top of the literal trash of the old one is what made the Bronze Age so unstable. They were trying to replicate a glory they hadn't earned, using materials they didn't fully understand. The records get strangely quiet here about the actual religious practices of the time, but we can see the shift in the artifacts. The gods were no longer family members you invited to dinner. They were distant, terrifying forces you bribed to stay away. And while everyone pretended the world was fresh and clean, the ground was still soft. The economy of this new era was based on bronze, an alloy of copper and tin. But tin was hard to find. It required trade routes that spanned the known world. The logistics of the Bronze Age were a house of cards, built on the hope that the rain would stay in the clouds and the neighbors wouldn't get too hungry. As the Bronze Age matured, the memory of the flood didn't fade, it hardened. It became a kind of cultural scar tissue. In the citadels of Mycenae and Tiryns, the architecture began to reflect a people who were perpetually waiting for the other shoe or the other storm to drop. They weren't just building for the wars of men, they were building for the whims of the atmosphere.
Historians debate whether the massive drainage systems found in these ancient palaces were purely for sanitation or if they were a psychological response to the trauma of the Great Flood. These people were obsessed with the movement of water. They diverted rivers, drained lakes like Lake Kopais, and engineered the landscape with a ferocity that suggested they were trying to show Zeus they could handle whatever he threw at them. It was a defiant kind of engineering. But that isn't the weirdest part. While the engineers were busy with the plumbing, the palace elites were busy with the propaganda. The descendants of Deucalion and Pyrrha, now established as the rightful kings of the Greek mainland, began to craft genealogies that linked them directly to the survivors of the chest.
If you could prove you were of the stone, you were elite. Everyone else was just mud. This created a rigid, paranoid social structure. The stone people saw themselves as a superior, more durable version of humanity. This decision to base their entire social hierarchy on a survival story would age very badly once the actual Bronze Age collapse began. But for a few centuries, it kept the peace, or at least it kept everyone too busy working on the walls to complain. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the Mediterranean, the climate was actually becoming more stable, which ironically made the gods seem even more distant and unpredictable. In Egypt, the new kingdom was rising, and their relationship with the flood had become a ritualized celebration. They had tamed the chaos of none into a calendar. But in Greece, the memory of the water remained sharp and jagged. The records get strangely quiet here about the fate of the common people. We hear plenty about the kings with their gold masks and their ivory-inlaid chariots, but the stony workers who actually moved the limestone blocks are largely invisible. They were the ones living in the shadow of the citadels, knowing that if the sky ever turned dark again, the palace doors would likely be bolted from the inside. And while everyone pretended the new world was a triumph of human will over divine temper, the internal rot was beginning to set in. The wealth of the Bronze Age was built on a very fragile foundation of trade and tribute. They were importing tin from as far away as Britain and copper from Cyprus. It was a globalized economy that required everything to go perfectly. But in a world where the king of the gods had a history of starting over when things got complicated, perfectly was a high bar to clear. This period of stability was, in many ways, just a long, quiet pause between disasters. The palace politics were becoming increasingly focused on succession and maintaining the purity of the stone bloodlines. Inbreeding, while not as extreme as it would become later in dynasties, was already starting to show its face in the royal nurseries. The hard generation was beginning to soften, even as their walls grew thicker. As the years drifted into decades, the Bronze Age kings found themselves haunted by the very thing they tried to replace. They lived in the great after, but they were obsessed with the great before. There was a persistent rumor in the palaces that some of the Silver Age humans, the ones who hadn't been turned to wolves or drowned in the valleys, were still out there, hiding in the deep caves of the Pindus Mountains. Historians debate whether these survivor stories were actually memories of the pre-Indo-European inhabitants of Greece, the people the newcomers called Pelasgians. To the descendants of Deucalion and Pyrrha, these people were like ghosts. They represented a version of humanity that failed the divine test, yet somehow persisted. The stone people dealt with this anxiety by building even bigger shrines. They wanted to prove to Zeus that they were the improved model, the one worth keeping. But that isn't the weirdest part. While the Greeks were building shrines to stay in Zeus's good graces, they were simultaneously looting the graves of the Silver Age. They would find these ancient burial mounds scoured by the floodwaters and pull out artifacts that shouldn't have existed. Delicate silver filigree, strange obsidian tools, and jewelry that seemed too fine for a failed race. This created a strange paradox in the Bronze Age economy. You had a warrior culture that valued strength and stony resilience, yet the ultimate status symbols were the fragile relics of an era deleted. It was as if they were wearing the clothes of a ghost and wondering why they felt a chill. The internal rot was no longer just about corruption, it was about an identity crisis. Were they the masters of the new world, or just the janitors cleaning up the mess of the old one? Meanwhile, elsewhere in the Mediterranean, The Hittites and the Egyptians were entering a period of intense diplomatic back and forth. They were the superpowers of the day, and they viewed the Greek mainland as a bit of a rugged frontier. They traded for the stone people's timber and wool, but they kept them at arm's length. The Greeks, sensing this, leaned even harder into their mythology. They started claiming that their kings didn't just survive the flood, but that they were actually the favorites of the Olympians. The records get strangely quiet here about the actual weather patterns. For a generation that was defined by a flood, they seem to have stopped writing about the rain. Perhaps it was a form of collective superstition. If you don't mention the clouds, they won't gather. But the geological record suggests that the climate was actually beginning to dry out. The very water that had once threatened to drown them was now becoming a scarce resource. And while everyone pretended the citadels were eternal, the foundations were starting to settle. The stone bloodlines were becoming increasingly tangled. Succession was no longer a simple matter of the strongest son taking the throne. It was a labyrinth of cousins, half-brothers, and miraculous births. The palace politics were becoming a game of shadows played out in the torchlit corridors of Mycenae. This decision to focus on bloodline purity over actual competence is a recurring irony in history. They were so afraid of being replaced by the gods that they ensured their own decline through internal dysfunction. The hard people were becoming brittle. They were still building with massive stones, but the mortar holding them together, the social contract, was starting to crumble into sand. As we moved deeper into the heart of the Bronze Age, the primary anxiety of the Greek world began to shift. The fear of drowning was slowly replaced by the much more practical, much more terrifying fear of thirst. Historians and paleoclimatologists debate whether a prolonged drought was the actual trigger for the eventual collapse of the Mycenaean civilization, but in the stories of the time, it felt like a second divine punishment. Zeus, it seemed, had grown tired of the rain and decided to see how the stone people fared under a relentless sun. The massive drainage systems that were once a source of pride became monuments to a climate that no longer existed. The cisterns, deep and cool, were now the most guarded rooms in the palace, more valuable than the gold rooms or the armories. This matters later because it redefined the role of the king. A king was no longer just a survivor of the flood, he was the master of the well. If he couldn't make it rain, or at least keep the water flowing from the mountain springs, his stony pedigree didn't mean much to a thirsty population. But that isn't the weirdest part. As the rivers shrank, they began to reveal things that had been buried under deep silt for centuries. In the drying riverbeds of the Eurotas and the Alpheus, people found the remains of Silver Age villages that were perfectly preserved in the mud, like insects in amber. They found houses with the hearths still set, and temples where the offerings were still on the altars. It was as if the flood had just paused their lives, and now the drought was inviting the new world to walk through the ruins. This decision to scavenge the ghost villages became a major part of the late Bronze Age economy. They weren't just finding jewelry anymore. They were finding ancient agricultural techniques and irrigation secrets that the Silver Age had mastered before their fall. It was a strange, circular kind of progress, the new world learning how to survive from the very people the gods had deleted for being too arrogant. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the Mediterranean, the geopolitical tension was reaching a boiling point. The Sea Peoples, a mysterious coalition of displaced tribes, were starting to appear on the horizon. They were the ultimate outsiders, people who had no connection to the stone of Greece or the sun of Egypt. They were hungry, they were mobile, and they didn't care about anyone's divine genealogy. The records get strangely quiet here about the Sea People's origins.
Some historians think that they were the victims of the same drought that was choking Greece, but others think they were the result of an internal collapse in the West. Whatever the cause, they were a logistical nightmare for the established empires. They didn't fight like gentlemen, they fought like a force of nature.
And while everyone in the palaces was pretending that a few more sacrifices would bring back the rain, the social contract was finally snapping. The commoners, the mud people who did all the work, were watching the royal families grow even more insular and obsessed with their stone bloodlines. The internal rot was no longer hidden in the shadows. It was visible in the empty granaries and the dry fountains. The irony was thick. The civilization born from a flood was now dying for a drop of water. This decision to ignore the environmental reality in favor of maintaining palace rituals is what made the end so quiet and yet so absolute. They were so busy looking at the sky for a sign of Zeus's temper that they didn't notice the fire starting in their own backyards. The transition from a thriving, golden-masked empire to a series of smoking ruins was beginning, and it wouldn't take a flood to finish it. As the dust continued to settle over the parched valleys of the Peloponnese, the Bronze Age Greeks began to realize that the drought wasn't just a weather pattern, it was an eviction notice. But while the physical world was shrinking, the psychological world was expanding. People were no longer just looking at the horizon for rain, they were looking into the past for answers. Historians debate whether this intense ancestor worship was a way to maintain social order during a resource crisis, or if it was a genuine spiritual breakdown. The stone people became obsessed with the concept of Nostos, a homecoming. But they weren't trying to return to their houses, they were trying to return to the favor of the gods. They started reopening the tombs of the Silver Age, not to loot them, but to apologize to them. But that isn't the weirdest part. In the middle of this spiritual crisis, a new kind of prophecy began to emerge from the mountain shrines. It wasn't about the future of the kingdom or the outcome of a war, it was about the hidden king. Rumors spread from village to village that a direct descendant of Deucalion, one who hadn't been corrupted by the palace politics of Mycenae, was living in a cave on Mount Parnassus, guarding the original wooden chest. This matters later because it provided a focal point for the growing resentment of the common people. They started to believe that the reason the rain had stopped was that the current kings were false stones. They had lost the durability of their ancestors. This decision to seek a purer leader is a recurring theme in the slow fall of empires. When the present becomes unbearable, the past becomes a utopia. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the Mediterranean, the collapse was already happening in real time. The Hittite Empire, once the great rival of Egypt, was literally starving to death. Their records speak of a year without a harvest, followed by a year without a seed. The logistics of their empire, which relied on the constant movement of grain from the Anatolian highlands, had completely broken down. They were sending desperate letters to the pharaoh, begging for shipments of wheat that Egypt could barely afford to spare. The records get strangely quiet here about the actual responses from Egypt. It seems the pharaoh was too busy dealing with his own internal rot. The Egyptian bureaucracy, which had survived for thousands of years by managing the Nile, was finding that the river was no longer behaving. The great return of chaos that they had feared for generations was happening, not through a flood, but through a slow, agonizing retreat of the water. And while the high kings were exchanging polite, panicked letters, the sea peoples were moving. They weren't an army, they were a migration of the desperate. They were the people who had already lost everything and had nothing left to fear. As they moved toward the coastal Greece, they didn't see citadels of stone people, they saw targets. This decision to remain focused on internal bloodlines while a literal tidal wave of humanity was approaching is one of the great leadership disasters of the era. The Mycenaean kings were still busy proving they were the rightful heirs of Deucalion, that they forgot how to be generals. They were still polishing their gold masks while the horizon was turning black with the smoke of burning coastal villages. The transition from the great after to the dark age was no longer a possibility, it was an inevitability.
The transition from the stony resilience of Deucalion's heirs to an absolute palace paralysis was nearly complete. In the great halls of Mycenae, the air was thick with the smell of expensive incense and unwashed fear. The drought had persisted for so long that the very idea of a flood felt like a cruel joke from a different planet. Historians debate whether the Mycenaean Greeks actually knew the end was coming, or if they were victims of a normalcy bias, the belief that because the walls were thick, the world would remain stable. But the archaeology tells a different story. In the final years, we see the palace kitchens being moved deep inside the fortifications. We see the secret cisterns being expanded with a kind of feverish energy. They weren't just storing water, they were storing time. But this isn't the weirdest part. As the Sea Peoples began their systematic dismantling of the coastal trade routes, the Greek kings did something strange. Instead of forming a grand coalition, a Bronze Age version of the Avengers, they turned inward. They began to fight over the few remaining mountain springs that hadn't dried up. It was a civil war conducted in whispers and small bloody skirmishes over mud. This matters later because it explains why the eventual fall was so absolute. There was no one left to hold the door. The stone people had become so obsessed with their internal hierarchies that they had forgotten how to function as a society. This decision to prioritize local grudges over global threats is a recurring irony in the slow fall of empires. They were still arguing about whose great-grandfather threw the bigger stone, while their granaries were being emptied by people who didn't even know who Deucalion was. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the Mediterranean, the light was going out in the east. The city of Ugarit, the great cosmopolitan hub of the Levant, sent out one final desperate letter. It described the sea ships appearing on the horizon and the fire consuming the surrounding fields. The letter was found in a kiln, never sent, because the city fell before the clay could even cool. It's a chilling reminder that history doesn't always end with a long, drawn-out monologue. Sometimes it just cuts to black. The records get strangely quiet here about the actual siege of Mycenae. There are no epic poems from the time describing a heroic last stand. Instead, we find the remains of a fire, a massive, intense heat that turned the palace frescoes into charred flakes. It wasn't just a battle, it was a cleaning. The great after was being deleted, just as the Silver Age had been before it. And while everyone in the surrounding villages watched the smoke rise from the citadels, the myth of the stone people finally shattered. The gods hadn't sent a flood this time. They had simply let the humans finish what they had started. The internal rot had finally consumed the structure. The economy, the bloodlines, the propaganda, it all collapsed into a pile of ash and limestone. This decision to stay behind the walls until the very end meant that when the collapse came, there was no transition. There was just a sudden, heavy silence. The trade routes vanished. The writing system, Linear B, was forgotten within a generation. The world became small, dark, and local again. But as the survivors of the Dark Age looked up at the charred ruins on the hills, they began to tell a new story, one that wasn't about stones or floods, but about the hubris that had brought it all down. The transition from the smoldering ruins of the Bronze Age to the long, quiet century of the early Iron Age was not a graceful one. It was a collapse so total that the very concept of the state vanished from the Greek psyche. The stone people were gone, or more accurately, they were no longer special. When the palace walls fell, the distinction between the royal heirs of Deucalion and the people of the mud evaporated in the heat of the fires.
Historians debate whether this period was truly a dark age or simply a necessary pruning of a system that had become too heavy for its own roots. But for the survivors, it was a time of profound amnesia. The logistics of the previous world, the trade routes for tin, the scribes who kept track of every jar of oil, the kings who claimed to speak for the clouds, were replaced by the brutal simplicity of subsistence.
But that isn't the weirdest part. While the cities were being reclaimed by the scrub brush and the wild goats, the stories of the Great Flood began to transform. They were no longer political tools used to justify a king's tax rate. They became folk memories, told around much smaller fires in much smaller houses. In these versions, Zeus wasn't just a CEO cleaning house. He was a distant, terrifying reminder that nothing, not even a citadel made of 5-ton limestone blocks, is permanent. This matters later because it fundamentally changed Greek religion. The Olympians were no longer neighbors, they were the other. This decision to distance the divine from the human realm was born from the trauma of watching the favored bloodlines fall so completely. If the gods could let the heirs of Deucalion fall so completely, then the gods were not to be trusted. They were to be feared and managed from a safe distance. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the Mediterranean, the collapse had created a vacuum that was being filled by the Phoenicians. While the Greeks were forgetting how to write, the Phoenicians were simplifying the process, creating an alphabet that would eventually give the Greeks their memory back. It's a recurring irony in history. The people who survive the end of the world are often the ones who weren't invited to the party in the first place. The records get strangely quiet here, because quite literally, there were no records. Linear B was a tool of the palace, and without a palace, there was no need for a tool. For 300 years, the history of the flood and the stone people existed only as vibration in the air, spoken words passed from parent to child. And while everyone was busy surviving, the landscape itself was healing. The drought eventually broke and the rains returned, but they didn't bring back the Mycenaean kings. They brought back the forests. The grand palaces became haunted places, avoided by the local shepherds who believed the ghosts of the Silver Age and the Bronze Age were now rooming together in the ruins. This decision to treat the past as a forbidden, ghostly realm is why the Greek myths are so vibrant and terrifying. They aren't just stories, they are the debris of a lost reality. The internal rot of the first world had been washed away by water, and the rot of the second world had been burned away by fire. Now the third world, the Iron Age, was beginning to stir in the shadows of the old citadels, and it was carrying a very different kind of stone in its pockets. As the Greek world slumbered through its long, illiterate Iron Age, the logistics of memory were being reinvented in the Levant. It's worth drifting over to the Phoenician coast for a moment, because without their specific brand of mercantile pragmatism, the story of Deucalion and the flood might simply have evaporated into the mountain mist. The Phoenicians weren't interested in divine temper tantrums or the purity of stone-born kings. They were interested in receipts. Historians debate how much of the Greek reawakening was a solo project and how much was a hostile takeover of Phoenician technology. By the time the Greek survivors were starting to trade their wool and timber again, the Phoenicians had already perfected a shorthand for language. They had stripped away the complex palace-dependent hieroglyphs and cuneiform and replaced them with 22 simple signs. It was a democratization of information. You didn't need a royal archive to keep a record. You just needed a piece of broken pottery and a bit of ink. But that isn't the weirdest part. As the Greeks adopted this alphabet, they didn't just use it for trade, they used it to catch the ghosts of the Bronze Age. They began to write down the oral poems that had been floating around their campfires for centuries. This matters later because it's the moment the flood story stopped being a living trauma and started being literature. When you write something down, you freeze it. You turn a warning into a legend.
This decision to archive their own mythology was a psychological turning point. The Greeks were no longer the people running from the water, they were the people studying it. But the internal rot of the new era was already present in the ink. By standardizing the myths, they began to create a canonical history that conveniently ignored the actual diversity of the post-flood world. They were editing their own origins, smoothing over the cracks in the stone.
Meanwhile, elsewhere in the Mediterranean, the Romans were still just a collection of mud huts on a group of hills, but they were already watching the Greeks with a mixture of envy and suspicion. They would eventually take the story of the flood and turn it into a legalistic argument about divine contracts, but for now, they were just another group of survivors trying to figure out why the sky sometimes turned black. The records get strangely quiet here about the actual transition of the alphabet. We see the results, the sudden explosion of Greek inscriptions in the 8th century BC, but the actual moment of the handoff is lost to history. It likely happened in a crowded port city like Almina, over cups of wine and arguments about the price of cedar. It was a revolution born of convenience, not a divine revelation. And while the Greeks were learning to write again, they were rediscovering their own ruins. They began to call the Mycenaean walls Cyclopean because they could no longer imagine that humans, even stone-born ones, had built them. The previous world had become so alien that it required a supernatural explanation. They were strangers in their own land, living in the shadow of a greatness they had forgotten how to maintain. This decision to mythologize their own ancestors created a permanent sense of inferiority in the Greek psyche. They were the men of iron, a further downgrade from the men of bronze and the men of silver. They were living in the sunset of the world, or so they thought. But in reality, they were building the foundations of a new kind of empire, one built not on massive stones, but on the much more durable architecture of the written word. As the 8th century BC dawned, the Greek world was no longer just surviving, it was beginning to explain itself. This transition from a cluster of quiet iron-working villages to a competitive network of city-states required a shared history. They needed a why. The oral traditions of the flood, which had been floating in the air for centuries like smoke, were finally pulled down and anchored into the first great epics. Historians debate whether the poet we call Homer was a single man or a convenient label for a collective movement, but the effect was the same. The stone people of Deucalion were codified. The messy, terrifying reality of a drowning world was organized into a series of rhythmic, predictable verses. This matters later because it gave the Greeks a sense of destiny. They weren't just the descendants of survivors, they were the protagonists of a divine drama. But that isn't the weirdest part. As the poets began to formalize the story of Zeus and the Great Flood, they started to add a layer of soft sarcasm to the gods themselves. In the epics, the Olympians are powerful, yes, but they are also deeply dysfunctional. They bicker over dinner, they hold grudges over minor slights, and they treat the destruction of humanity like a particularly stressful board game. This decision to humanize the divine was a psychological defense mechanism. If you can make a god look ridiculous, they are slightly less terrifying. The internal rot of the new Greek society, the growing divide between the wealthy aristocrats and the common farmers, was mirrored in the stories of the gods. The best families in Athens and Sparta claimed they were the literal stones of Pyrrha, using the flood myth to justify why they owned the best olive groves, while everyone else worked the rocky hillsides. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the Mediterranean, the Assyrians were perfecting the art of the empire in the east. They weren't interested in floods, they were interested in sieges. Their records are a grim catalog of conquest, yet even they had their own version of the flood story, the Epic of Gilgamesh.
The Greeks likely encountered these Eastern versions through their trade with the Phoenicians, leading to a strange cross-pollination of tragedies. The records get strangely quiet here about the actual climate of the 8th century. After the long drought that broke the Bronze Age, the weather seems to have settled into the Mediterranean pattern we recognize today. The fear of a global deluge had moved from the gut to the library. It was now a classic, something you studied to understand your own culture, rather than something you looked for in the clouds every afternoon.
And while the aristocrats were busy tracing their lineages back to Deucalion's chest, the first Greek colonies were being sent out across the sea. They were traveling to Italy, Sicily, and the Black Sea, carrying their stories with them like seeds. Every new city they founded had a temple to Zeus, but it also had a library, or at least a place where the poets could perform. This decision to export their Greek mythology turned the Greek flood into a global brand. They weren't just colonizing land, they were colonizing the imagination of the Mediterranean. But the internal rot was still there, hidden in the beautiful language of the poems. They were building a world on the idea that they were special, chosen by a god who had once tried to drown their ancestors. It was a foundation built on a paradox, a civilization that celebrated its own near extinction. As we drift into the 5th century BC, the story of Zeus and his great flood underwent its most sophisticated transformation yet. The transition from the rhythmic sung epics of the earlier age to the sharp intellectual scrutiny of classical Athens changed the very texture of the myth. This was the age of the philosophers and the playwrights, people who weren't satisfied with a simple story about a vengeful god and a wooden box. They wanted to know about the ethics of the drowning. Historians debate whether the intellectual elite of Athens actually believed in the literal flood, or if they viewed it as a useful allegory for the fragility of the polis. In the works of Plato, the flood is mentioned almost casually as a historical reset button. He describes a world that has been washed clean multiple times, suggesting that humanity is prone to a kind of spiritual amnesia every few thousand years. But that isn't the weirdest part. While the philosophers were using the flood to explain the cycles of history, the politicians were using it to explain the cycles of power. In the shadow of the Parthenon, the flood story became a way to talk about the Persian Wars. The Persians were the new flood, a chaotic, overwhelming force from the east that threatened to submerge the Greek way of life. By framing their victory as a survival of a second great deluge, the Athenians justified their own burgeoning empire. They were the new stones, the ones who would rebuild the world in their own image. This matters later because it baked a specific kind of arrogance into the classical world. This decision to view themselves as the peak of human resilience meant they stopped looking for the warning signs of their own internal rot in their own walls. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the Mediterranean, the Romans were beginning to expand their influence beyond the Seven Hills. They were looking at the Greek myths with the kind of calculated interest a younger sibling has for an older brother's inheritance. They didn't just want the stories, they wanted the authority that came with them. They began to adopt the flood myth, but they stripped away the Greek snark. For the Romans, Jupiter wasn't a dysfunctional CEO, he was the law. The flood wasn't a temper tantrum, it was a sentence. The records get strangely quiet here about the actual religious practices surrounding the flood in Athens. There was no Great Flood Festival. Instead, the memory was integrated into the daily rituals of the state. Every time a new building was dedicated or a new law was passed, there was a subtle nod to the idea that this stability was hard-won and easily lost. It was a culture of permanent, quiet anxiety.
And while the playwrights like Sophocles and Euripides were exploring the tragedy of the human condition, the environment was once again beginning to shift. The classical climate optimum, a period of warm, stable weather, was in full swing. This made the stories of the flood feel even more like ancient history, something that happened in a different, darker world. The logistics of the present were so successful that the catastrophes of the past felt impossible. This decision to treat the flood as a purely literary device would age very badly once the weather turned again. But for a few glorious decades, it allowed the Greeks to feel like they had finally conquered the chaos of none. They were living in a world of marble and logic, where the rain always fell at the right time and the gods stayed on their mountaintops. But as we've seen before, the silence of the gods is often just the sound of them gathering their strength for the next start over. The transition from the intellectual, often cynical Greek interpretation of the flood to the rigid, legalistic Roman version was like moving from a poetry workshop to a courtroom. By the time Rome became the dominant power in the Mediterranean, the story of Zeus, now Jupiter, and the Great Flood was no longer just a piece of heritage, it was a precedent. The Romans didn't have much use for the stone people as a metaphor for resilience. They wanted the flood as a metaphor of the absolute authority of the state. Historians debate whether the Romans actually cared about the Greek myths or if they were simply engaged in a massive branding exercise to give their young empire some much-needed gravitas. When the playwright Ovid wrote his Metamorphoses, he gave the flood the full Hollywood treatment. He described the world ending not with a whisper, but with a terrifying bureaucratic precision. Jupiter doesn't just get angry, he holds a council. He presents his evidence against humanity like a prosecutor. But that isn't the weirdest part. While Ovid was making the flood official, the Roman engineers were busy building the most sophisticated water management systems the world had ever seen. The aqueducts, the sewers, the massive bath complexes, these were the Roman answers to the flood. They weren't afraid of the water anymore, they had enslaved it. This matters later because it created a sense of technological invincibility. They believed that as long as the concrete held and the arches stood, they were immune to the divine resets that had deleted the Greeks in the Silver Age. This decision to view nature as something to be conquered rather than feared was the ultimate Roman hubris. It worked for centuries, but it left them with no plan B. The internal rot of the Roman era was a slow, creeping thing, and a reliance on infinite expansion, and a belief that the climate was a fixed, predictable background to their glory. They forgot that the original flood came because the gods were bored with human arrogance. And meanwhile, elsewhere in the world, the Vikings were still a few centuries away from their peak, but the Germanic tribes were already moving into the Roman orbit. They brought with them their own versions of the end, stories of winter that never ends, and seas that rise to meet the stars. The Romans dismissed these as the superstitions of barbarians, unaware that their own marble cities were just as fragile as a Greek chest. The records get strangely quiet here about the actual religious impact of the flood in Rome. Unlike the Greeks, who saw it as a beginning, the Romans saw it as a closed case. They were the new world, and they were too busy building roads to worry about ancient rain. But every now and then, a massive flood of the Tiber would remind them that Jupiter still had his lightning bolts, and the water still knew the way into the city streets. And while the emperors were busy polishing their marble busts, the social contract was beginning to fray at the edges. The gap between the bread and circuses of the masses and the decadence of the elite was widening. The stone was starting to crack, not from the pressure of the water outside, but from the lack of integrity within.
This decision to ignore the spiritual warnings of their own adopted myths in favor of material gain is what made the Roman decline so long and agonizing. They were the masters of the world, yes, but they were living in a house built of stolen stories and conquered water. The transition from the height of the empire to the slow, muddy decline of the later centuries was beginning, and no amount of concrete could hold back the tide once the gods decided it was time to move on. As the Roman Empire transitioned from its peak into the complicated, messy reality of the 3rd century, the story of the flood began to take on a much more literal and uncomfortable resonance. For centuries, the Romans had operated on the assumption that they had solved the problem of water. They had tiled it, channeled it, and turned it into a leisure activity. But as the empire's borders began to vibrate with the movement of the Germanic tribes and the internal economy started to stutter, the climate itself seemed to withdraw its support. Historians debate whether the Roman warm period coming to an end was the final shove that sent the empire into a tailspin, but for the people living through it, it felt like the gods were changing the rules again. The logistics of the empire, the massive shipments of grain from North Africa and Egypt, depended on a predictable sea and a predictable sun. When the rains began to fail in the south and the floods began to become more violent in the north, the eternal nature of Rome started to look like a very expensive mistake. But that isn't the weirdest part. While the emperors were busy devaluing the currency to pay for a bloated military, a new kind of story began to spread through the tenements of the Suburra and the villas of the elite. It was a version of the flood story that didn't come from Greek poetry or Roman law, but from the East. It was a story about a man named Noah, a different kind of chest, and a god who didn't hold a council with other gods, but acted alone. This matters later because it replaced the Roman concept of a cycle with a conclusion. For the Greeks and the early Romans, the flood was something that happened and could happen again, a rhythmic reset. For the early Christians and the mystery cults, the flood was a prototype for the final judgment. It turned the anxiety of the present into a countdown. This decision to view history as a straight line toward an endpoint changed the way the Romans reacted to crisis. They stopped trying to fix the plumbing and started looking for the exit. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the world, the Germanic tribes were dealing with their own version of the Great Return. They didn't have aqueducts, they had rivers that were freezing solid. The Fimbulwinter of Norse memory, the winter that lasts for 3 years, was likely a cultural echo of the cooling climate that was pushing these tribes south toward the Roman borders. They weren't an invading army so much as they were a rival group of survivors looking for a dry, warm place to wait out the dark. The records get strangely quiet here about the maintenance of the great waterworks. We see the archaeology of neglect, the silt building up in the harbors, the arches of the aqueduct starting to crumble because there weren't enough workers to patch the mortar. The internal rot was a lack of care. Rome was still beautiful on the surface, but it was a beauty that required a level of logistical support the state could no longer provide. And while everyone was distracted by the palace coups and the rising price of bread, the stone people of the new age, the Roman citizens, were finding that their heritage didn't protect them from the mud. When the Tiber flooded now, it stayed in the streets longer. It brought disease and filth into the marble halls. The distinction between the master of the world and a refugee from the floods was becoming dangerously thin. This decision to prioritize short-term military survival over long-term environmental and social infrastructure is a recurring theme in the fall of empires. They were so busy fighting the barbarians at the gate that they didn't notice the foundations of the gate were being washed away. The transition from a world of law and order to a world of mud and memory was accelerating, And the gods, as they usually do when things get this messy, were simply watching the water rise. The transition from the Roman 3rd century crisis into the early migration period was less like a sudden flood and more like a slow, freezing seep. If you were a Roman citizen living in a border town along the Danube, the world didn't end with a thunderbolt from Jupiter. It ended with the sound of thousands of boots crunching on frozen river water. The climate was cooling, and the grain harvests in the north were failing. The stone people of Rome were about to meet the ice people of the north, and both were looking for the same thing: dry ground. Historians debate whether the Great Migration was triggered by a specific environmental disaster or just a series of very bad winters, but the result was a logistical collapse that no amount of Roman law could fix. The aqueducts, once the pride of the empire, were now being used as bridges by people who had never seen a marble bath. The water management that had defined Roman civilization was being ignored, and as a result, the land was reverting to its primordial state. But that isn't the weirdest part. As the Germanic tribes, the Goths, the Vandals, the Alemanni, moved into Roman territory, they didn't just bring their families, they brought their myths. They brought stories of the Midgard serpent, a creature that lived in the deep ocean and would eventually rise to drown the world during Ragnarok. For them, the flood wasn't a punishment for a bad dinner party like Lycaon's. It was a cosmic certainty. It was the way the world was supposed to end. This matters later because it created a strange psychological collision. You had the Romans, who were trying to hold back the chaos with concrete and bureaucracy, living side by side with people who believed that chaos was the ultimate winner. This decision to live in the shadow of an inevitable apocalypse changed the architecture of the early Middle Ages. People stopped building for eternity and started building for the season. They stopped making monuments and started making fortifications. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the Mediterranean, the Christian church was busy taking the story of Deucalion and his wooden box and relabeling it. They were systematic about it. The bones of the mother were no longer rocks, they were the relics of saints. The flood was no longer a pagan reset, it was a divine cleansing of sin. This decision to baptize the old myths allowed the stories to survive, but they lost their snark. Zeus was replaced by a more stern, singular judge, and the humor of the Olympians was replaced by the gravity of the soul. The records get strangely quiet here about the actual survival of the common people. We hear about the fall of Rome, but for a farmer in the Italian countryside, the fall was just a series of people in different hats asking for his wheat. The internal rot of the state had become so advanced that the transition from a Roman province to a Gothic kingdom was almost invisible. The marble was still there, but the stone people were now just people trying to stay warm. And while the high-ranking officials were fleeing to Constantinople, the physical geography of the West was changing. The aqueducts failed, the marshes returned to the Italian plains. The great return of chaos that the Egyptians had feared and the Greeks had mythologized was finally happening. The world was becoming damp, dark, and very quiet. This decision to let the infrastructure of the world slide into the mud is what defines the start of the Dark Ages. It wasn't that people forgot how to build, it's that they no longer had the luxury of thinking long-term. They were living in a post-flood reality, even though the water was only ankle-deep. The transition from the eternal city to a collection of village-sized ruins was complete, and the memory of Deucalion's chest was once again just a story told by firelight to keep the dark at bay.
While the Western Roman Empire was being slowly reclaimed by the marshes and the forests, the East, the world we now call Byzantium, was engaged in a massive logistical feat of survival.
The transition from the unified Roman world to this Byzantine arc was a masterpiece of palace politics and sheer administrative stubbornness. In Constantinople, they didn't see themselves as a new world. They saw themselves as the final, fortress-like version of the old one. If the West was the world after the flood, the East was the chest itself, bolted from the inside and floating on a sea of barbarian tribes. Historians debate whether the Byzantine obsession with order and hierarchy was a natural evolution of Roman law or a desperate psychological reaction to the chaos outside their walls. In the capital, the memory of Zeus and his great flood was treated like a dangerous antique. They didn't want the unpredictability of the Olympians. They wanted the predictable, structured salvation of the Orthodox Church. But the irony was that their very city was defined by water. The massive cisterns of Constantinople, like the Basilica cistern, were underground cathedrals of logistics designed to hold enough water to survive a siege of years. But that isn't the weirdest part. While the Byzantines were busy building stone reservoirs, they were also building a legal reservoir of Greek and Roman knowledge. They're the ones who finally organized the thousands of contradictory stories about the flood into a singular, state-approved history. This matters later because it's the version that would eventually travel back to the West during the Renaissance. This decision to freeze history in the name of stability meant that the Byzantines became the ultimate librarians of a drowning world. They were keeping the scrolls dry while the floor was slowly leaking. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the Mediterranean, the rise of a new power in the south was beginning to shift the geography of memory yet again. From the deserts of Arabia, a civilization was emerging that viewed the flood not as a Greco-Roman tragedy, but a Quranic certainty, the story of Nuh. This version emphasized the logistics of the message over the logistics of the boat. It wasn't about the stone people surviving through their own durability. It was about the absolute submission to a single divine will. The records get strangely quiet here about the actual maintenance of the Great Walls of Constantinople. We know they were the most sophisticated defense system in the world, but we also know they were built on soft ground. The internal rot of Byzantium was a specific kind of succession paranoia. Because the emperor was seen as God's representative on earth, every time an emperor died without a clear heir, it felt like the flood was starting all over again. The palace politics were a whirlpool of blinded rivals, eunuch advisors, and miraculous military coups. And while the city of Constantine glittered behind its triple walls, the world outside was getting colder and wetter. The late antique Little Ice Age was in full swing. This wasn't a myth, it was a reality recorded in the tree rings. The plagues and the crop failures of the 6th century were the new rain, a slow-motion catastrophe that no amount of marble could stop. The Byzantines responded by becoming even more insular, even more obsessed with the right way to burn incense and the right way to tax a starving farmer. This decision to prioritize religious dogma over environmental reality is a recurring theme in the slow collapse of the Byzantine world. They were so convinced their city was the Ark of God that they didn't notice the water was rising within the hall. The transition from a global superpower to a besieged city-state was beginning, and the story of the flood was no longer about the ancient past. It was a daily lived-in fear of being the last ones left alive.
While the Byzantines were curating their libraries and sealing their cisterns, the far north was experiencing a different kind of rising water. The transition from the isolated fjords of Scandinavia to the explosive expansion of the Viking Age was driven by a climate that was, briefly, becoming more forgiving.
The medieval warm period was beginning to thaw the northern coasts, opening up trade routes and, more importantly, creating a surplus of young men with no land and very little patience. Historians debate whether the Viking raids were a response to overpopulation or simply a byproduct of superior naval logistics. In the Norse mind, the sea wasn't a barrier, it was a highway. Their version of the flood story, the drowning of the world in Ymir's blood, gave them a unique relationship with the water. They didn't fear the rising tide, they lived on it. Their longships were the new arks, designed not to sit on a mountain peak and wait for the rain to stop, but to navigate the shallowest rivers and strike at the heart of the stone people in the south. But that isn't the weirdest part. As the Vikings began to raid the monasteries of England and France, they encountered the Christian version of the flood. They saw the golden reliquaries and the ornate Bibles that depicted Noah and his family. The Vikings, in their typical pragmatic fashion, likely viewed these as interesting art but poor strategy. Why build a giant box that can't move when you can build a ship that can outrun the wind? This matters later because it created a profound cultural clash. The Christians saw the Vikings as a second flood, a scourge of God sent to punish them for their own internal rot. This decision to frame the Viking raids as a divine catastrophe rather than a military problem made the defense of Europe incredibly difficult. Instead of building better walls, the monks spent their time writing prayers to be saved from the fury of the Northmen. It was a failure of logistics disguised as a spiritual crisis. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the world, the climate was playing a long game. While the north was warming, the southern Mediterranean was becoming increasingly arid. The Byzantines were losing their breadbasket provinces in North Africa to the expanding caliphates. The Byzantine arc was starting to feel very small. They were now surrounded by cultures that had their own versions of the flood and their own reasons for wanting to see the new Rome submerged. The records get strangely quiet here about the actual Norse religious transition. We know they eventually converted to Christianity, but the process was messy and internal. They kept their ship burials for centuries, even as they began to build stone churches. It was as if they were hedging their bets, praying to the new god for salvation while keeping a longship ready, just in case the Midgard serpent decided to wake up early. And while the Vikings were exploring the North Atlantic, reaching as far as Greenland and Vinland, they were living out the ultimate survivalist fantasy. They were the heirs of Bergelmir, finding new worlds in the middle of a vast, empty ocean. But the internal rot was starting to set in back home. The wealth from the raids was creating a new class of powerful chieftains who were more interested in palace politics than on the old communal laws of the Thing. This decision to centralize power into kingships, mirroring the very empires they had raided, is what eventually ended the Viking Age. They became the stone people they had once despised. They traded their wooden arks for stone cathedrals and their mobility for bureaucracy. The transition from the wild, blood-drowned myth of Ymir to the structured society of medieval Scandinavia was nearly complete, and the sea was once again just something you looked at from a safe, solid shore. The transition from the Viking Age into the High Middle Ages was marked by a world that was for the first time in centuries starting to feel crowded again. The Ice People and the Stone People had finally finished their long, violent merger, creating a feudal society that was obsessed with boundaries. If the earlier ages were about surviving the flood, the 12th and 13th centuries were about building the most elaborate dams possible, not just physical ones, but social and legal ones.
Historians debate whether the construction of the great Gothic cathedrals was a spiritual exercise or a massive public works project designed to keep a growing population occupied. In these stone giants, the story of the flood was literally etched into the glass and carved into the portals.
But the focus had shifted. It wasn't about Zeus's temper or the bones of Gaia anymore. It was about the Ark as a symbol of the church. If you were inside the stone walls, you were safe from the waters of sin. If you were outside, you were already drowning. But that isn't the weirdest part. While the bishops were perfecting the theology of the flood, the engineers were rediscovering the logistics of the Romans. They were building bridges, mill races, and canal systems that hadn't been seen since the days of the emperors. This matters later because it led to a new kind of internal rot. The wealth of the High Middle Ages was built on a very narrow climate window, the tail end of the medieval warm period. They were farming land that was usually too wet or too cold, confident that the sun would always shine and the rain would be polite. This decision to overextend their agricultural logistics was a gamble they didn't know they were making. They were building a world of stone on a foundation of good luck. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the world, the Mongols were moving across the steppes, a human tidal wave that made the Viking raids look like a drizzle. They were the new scourge, and they didn't care about the stone arcs of Europe or the theological nuances of the flood. The records get strangely quiet here about the actual maintenance of the smaller dikes and drainage systems. Everyone wanted to build a cathedral, but no one wanted to clean the silt out of the village irrigation ditches. The hierarchy was becoming top-heavy. The stone people of the nobility were becoming increasingly distant from the mud people who actually produced the grain. The social contract was being stretched thin, just as the weather was starting to turn. And while the scholars in Paris and Bologna were debating the literal dimensions of Noah's Ark, calculating exactly how many sheep could fit into a cubit, the first signs of the Little Ice Age were appearing. The harvests were getting shorter, the rains were becoming heavier and more unpredictable. The great return of chaos was no longer a story in a stained glass window. It was a cold, damp reality creeping into the granaries. This decision to remain focused on spiritual architecture while the physical environment was failing is a recurring theme in the slow fall of the medieval world. They were so busy defining the purity of their stone bloodlines and the correctness of their dogma that they forgot how to survive a bad harvest. The transition from the golden age of chivalry to the century of woes was beginning, and the story of the flood was about to become terrifyingly relevant once again. The transition from the relative stability of the High Middle Ages into the 14th century was not a gentle slope. It was a cliff. Historians often refer to this as the crisis of the late Middle Ages, but for the people on the ground, it felt like the original flood myth had finally caught up with them. The medieval warm period had officially ended, replaced by the Little Ice Age. The rains that began in 1315 didn't just water the crops, they drowned the world. This was the Great Famine, and it was a logistical nightmare that stripped away the veneer of chivalry and left behind a raw struggle for survival. Historians debate whether the environmental collapse was the primary cause or simply the catalyst for the social rot that followed. In the city of Paris, the price of grain tripled in a matter of weeks. The stone people of the nobility found that their titles couldn't buy bread when there was none to be had. The memory of Noah's Ark became a literal obsession again. People started looking at the rising rivers, the Seine, the Thames, the Danube, and wondered if the second cleansing had begun.
But that isn't the weirdest part. While the peasants were starving in the mud, the church was engaged in a massive internal schism. There were 2, and eventually 3, rival popes, each claiming to be the true captain of the spiritual ark. This matters later, because it shattered the idea of a unified, safe zone. If the leaders of the ark were fighting over the rudder, what hope was there for the passengers? The internal rot was no longer just about corruption.
It was about a complete breakdown of the social and divine contract. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the world, the Black Death was beginning its slow crawl out of the east. It followed the trade routes, the very same arteries that had brought wealth and silk, now brought a silent, invisible tide of death. The irony was thick. A civilization that had spent centuries obsessing over the waters of sin was being wiped out by a flea. The records get strangely quiet here about the actual death tolls in the rural areas. We have the grim accounts of the cities where the bells never stopped tolling, but in the villages, the silence was absolute. Entire hamlets were abandoned, left to be reclaimed by the forest, much like the Mycenaean citadels thousands of years before. The transition from a thriving feudal world to a landscape of ghosts was happening in real time. And while the survivors were trying to make sense of a world where half their neighbors were gone, the mythology of the flood began to evolve once more. The story of Deucalion and Pyrrha, which had been buried under layers of Christian theology, began to resurface in the early humanist circles of Italy. People like Petrarch began to look back at the stony resilience of the ancients. They saw the Middle Ages not as a triumph, but a long, dark inundation that they needed to emerge from. This decision to view their own recent history as a dark age, a term Petrarch himself coined, was the birth of the Renaissance. They were ready to throw the stones of the mother behind them and start over. But the rot was still there. The new world was being built on the bones of the old, using the same pride and the same patterns of exclusion. They were still building arcs. They just called them republics and signories now. The transition from the mud-cacked ruins of the 14th century to the glowing marble of the Italian Renaissance was a masterpiece of selective memory. By the mid-1400s, the intellectual climate had shifted. The flood was no longer a terrifying possibility for the coming Tuesday. It had been successfully pushed back into the realm of the antique. For the humanists in Florence and Rome, the drowning of the world was a philosophical necessity, a way to explain why the perfect knowledge of the Greeks and Romans had been lost for 1,000 years. It wasn't a tragedy, it was a transition. Historians debate whether the Renaissance was a genuine rebirth or just the most successful PR campaign in human history. In the workshops of Florence, the stone people returned, but this time they were carved from Carrara marble by the hands of Michelangelo and Donatello. The focus of the Deucalion myth shifted from the survival of the species to the survival of the intellect. They saw themselves as the new Pyrrhas, throwing the bones of the earth behind them and watching as a more refined, more enlightened version of humanity rose from the debris of the Middle Ages. But that isn't the weirdest part. While the artists were busy perfecting the human form, the engineers were rediscovering the Roman obsession with controlling the water. This was the age of Leonardo da Vinci, a man who was fascinated by the logistics of the deluge. His notebooks are filled with terrifyingly detailed drawings of swirling water and collapsing mountains. This matters later because it showed a shift in how humanity viewed catastrophe. It was no longer something to be prayed away. It was something to be modeled, measured, and eventually managed.
This decision to view the world through the lens of mathematics and observation was the birth of modern logistics, but it came with its own internal rot. The Renaissance elite became so obsessed with their own rebirth that they began to ignore the growing social inequalities beneath them. They were building a world of beautiful facades on a foundation of precarious banking and mercenary warfare. They were convinced that their arc of art was unsinkable, even as the religious and political stability of Europe was beginning to leak. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the world, the age of discovery was turning the ocean from a wall into a bridge. The Spanish and Portuguese were launching their own arcs into the Atlantic, looking for new worlds to save. For the people they encountered in the Americas, the arrival of these ships was a flood of a different kind, a deluge of iron, disease, and strange new gods that wiped out their existing civilizations with the same efficiency as Zeus's reign. The records get strangely quiet here about the actual faith of the common people. While the elites were discussing Plato and painting the Sistine Chapel, the average farmer was still living in fear of a bad harvest or a local flood. The stone people were becoming two different species, the refined marble of the court and the rough grit of the field. The transition from a unified Christian world to a fragmented, competitive landscape of nation-states was accelerating. And while the printing press was churning out thousands of copies of Ovid's Metamorphoses, the very concept of the flood was being debated by early scientists. They were finding seashells on the tops of mountains, fossilized evidence that the water had actually been there. This decision to look for physical evidence of the myth was the first step toward geology, but it also started to pull the thread of the divine story. If the flood was a natural event, then Zeus and the singular god who replaced him might just be a bystander. The transition from the artistic obsession of the Renaissance to the analytical rigor of the Enlightenment was like watching a flood recede only to find a perfectly ordered garden beneath it. By the 1700s, the story of Zeus and the Great Flood was no longer a matter of faith or artistic inspiration. It had become a problem of physics. The stone people were now the people of reason, and they were determined to categorize every drop of that ancient water. Historians debate whether the Enlightenment's attempt to deconstruct mythology was a liberating force or a loss of cultural soul. In the salons of Paris and London, the flood was debated as a geological event. This was the era of diluvialism, the theory that the physical features of the earth could be explained by the biblical or mythical deluge. They looked at the Grand Canyons and the stray boulders on plains and saw them not as divine anger, but as the logistics of moving fluid. But that isn't the weirdest part. While the scientists were busy arguing over sediment layers, the absolute monarchs of Europe were busy building their own versions of Olympus. Versailles was the new center of the world, a place where water was diverted for miles just to make a fountain dance for a king. This matters later because it showed that the internal rot of the stone bloodlines was reaching its peak. The aristocracy had become so detached from the reality of the earth that they viewed the landscape as a stage set. This decision to treat nature as a submissive servant rather than a terrifying force was a gamble that would age very badly. They were building a world of rigid social hierarchies on the assumption that the climate and the common people would remain forever stable. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the world, the Industrial Revolution was beginning to stir in the coal mines of Britain. A new kind of flood was coming, a flood of steam, iron, and smoke that would alter the world more permanently than any rain ever could. The records get strangely quiet here about the actual faith of the laborers who were digging the canals and diverting the rivers. While the elites were reading Voltaire and Diderot, the workers were still living in a world where a sudden flood meant the death of their children and the loss of their homes. The transition from a world of divine whim to a world of mechanical certainty was a luxury only the top 10% could afford.
And while the first encyclopedias were being printed, defining the flood as a mythical tradition, the physical evidence was becoming undeniable. Geologists like James Hutton were starting to realize that the Earth was much older than a few thousand years. They saw that the flood wasn't a single event, but a series of slow, agonizing changes over millions of years. This decision to prioritize deep time over mythical time was the final blow to the literal interpretation of the Greek stories. The stone people weren't born from a single moment of magic. They were the product of a slow, grinding history. The transition from the clockwork regularity of the Enlightenment to the soot-stained intensity of the 19th century felt like the world was trading its wooden chest for a steel boiler. By the mid-1800s, the story of Zeus and the Great Flood had been safely relegated to the nursery. It was a bedtime story, a quaint relic of a pre-scientific age. The people of the Victorian era were no longer worried about the gods drowning the world. They were much more concerned about the logistics of how to move millions of tons of coal and iron across newly paved continents. Historians debate whether the Industrial Revolution was humanity's final escape from the whims of nature or the moment we accidentally built our own flood. In the burgeoning cities of Manchester and Chicago, a new kind of rising tide was occurring. It wasn't water, but people, a deluge of workers leaving the rocky hillsides and stony rural life to submerge themselves in the smoke of the factories. This mattered later because it created a new type of internal rot. The city became a labyrinth of damp tenements and open sewers, a man-made swamp where the mud people lived in conditions that would have made a Bronze Age farmer feel lucky. But that isn't the weirdest part. While the engineers were busy damming rivers to power their textile mills, the geologists were finally providing the corpse of the ancient myths. They were finding the bones of literal giants, though they called them dinosaurs, and seeing that the Earth had indeed been submerged by vast prehistoric oceans. This decision to embrace deep time changed the narrative of the flood from a moral punishment to a cold geological cycle. They weren't surviving a god, they were surviving an epic. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the world, the British Empire was acting as the new Byzantine ark, curating the knowledge of the globe while aggressively expanding its borders. They were the masters of the sea, convinced that their ironclad ships were the ultimate defense against chaos. They even sent expeditions to Mount Ararat in the mountains of Greece, not to find the remains of a wooden box, but to map the superstition. They were colonizing the myth, turning the flood into a footnote in a British encyclopedia. The records get strangely quiet here about the actual air quality of the era. We have the data now, but at the time, the thick black fog of London was seen as the smell of progress. The internal rot was invisible, a slow accumulation of carbon and chemical runoff. They were so busy building their stone and steel cathedrals of industry that they didn't notice they were changing the very chemistry of the clouds. And while the Victorian elites were holding seances to talk to the ghosts of the past, the stone bloodlines were undergoing a final strange mutation. Wealth was no longer about land or ancient names, it was about the logistics of the machine. The transition from the hard aristocracy of the past to the liquid capital of the future was complete. They were still building arcs, but now they were made of steel, and they required a constant fire in their bellies to keep from sinking. This decision to view the earth as an infinite resource to be mined rather than a temperamental god to be appeased is a recurring theme in the modern era. They were so confident in their rudders and their engines that they forgot the lesson of the Silver Age, that the world has a way of resetting itself when the arrogance of its inhabitants reaches a certain weight. The transition to the 20th century was approaching, and the rain, though it had been quiet for a long time, was starting to feel heavy in the air once again.
The transition from the clatter of the Victorian machine to the silent, invisible systems of the 20th century was a period where humanity finally convinced itself it was the master of the deluge. By the middle of the 1900s, the story of Zeus and the Great Flood had moved from the nursery to the basement. It was now an archetype, a psychological curiosity for scholars. We were no longer afraid of the water. We had imprisoned it within massive walls of stone and concrete. We had turned the primordial chaos into a source of power for our own convenience. Historians debate whether this era was the peak of human hubris or the beginning of a desperate attempt at global control. In the halls of power, the people of the earth were replaced by a new kind of human, one detached from the soil. We were no longer building our lives out of the earth's bones. We were building them out of artificial dreams. This created a new type of internal rot. We became so disconnected from the physical reality of the Earth's cycles that we treated the world as a static backdrop, a fixed variable in a game of wealth. We were building a sanctuary out of fragile materials, confident that our cleverness could predict any storm. But that isn't the weirdest part. While we were busy perfecting our illusions, the physical world began to reveal the literal scars of the ancient past. Deep explorations of the earth began to show that the myth of a great flood had a terrifyingly physical basis. Beneath the silt of the great seas, there were traces of sudden, catastrophic rises in water that would have felt like the end of days to any ancient civilization. The irony is haunting. We found the proof of the ancient reset, just as we were inviting a new one. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the world, the great return of chaos is becoming a daily reality. We see the deluges in places that were once deserts, and the parched earth in places that were once breadbaskets. We are witnessing the slow, rhythmic failure of the systems we built to tame nature. The dams are silting up, the levees are being overtopped, and the stony pride of the elite is proving to be remarkably brittle when faced with a reality they cannot bribe or ignore. The records get strangely quiet here about the actual plan for the future. We have grand declarations and noble targets, but the actual movement is a crawl. The internal rot is a lack of collective will. We are like the residents of Troy, watching the horse being pulled through the gates, or the Silver Age Greeks serving a forbidden meal to a disguised god. We know something is wrong, but the lifestyle we've built is too addictive to abandon. And while the world becomes more unpredictable, the mythology of the flood is finding a new, gritty relevance. It's no longer a story for bedtime, it's a manual for survival. We are looking back at Deucalion and Pyrrha with a new kind of respect. They didn't have a plan to save the world, they just had a plan to survive the end of it. They didn't try to fix the sky, they just focused on the wood and the stones. This decision to prioritize individual endurance over systemic repair is the defining characteristic of this age. We are building metaphorical bubbles and literal shelters, hoping that when the water finally reaches the marble steps, we'll be the ones inside the box. The transition to the final chapters of our story is accelerating, and the rain, which has been falling in the background of history for thousands of years, is finally starting to outdrown the noise of our progress. The transition from our modern distractions to a deeper, more geological understanding of our place in the cycle is where the story of Zeus and the Great Flood begins to lose its irony and regain its weight. We are no longer satisfied with shallow explanations. We are looking into the literal mud of the deep past to see just how many times the slate has been wiped clean. Historians debate whether our current anxiety is a new phenomenon or a genetic memory of these ancient resets. In the silence of our deepest inquiries, we find that the Great Return isn't a single event, but a rhythmic pulse of the planet. There are layers of ash and silt in the deep earth that match the timelines of the Silver Age, the Bronze Age, and the fall of Rome. It's as if the earth itself is a record player, and we are just the latest track on a very old, very heavy vinyl.
But that isn't the weirdest part. While the scientists are busy counting the layers of mud, the culture is beginning to undergo a great narrowing. We are realizing that our silicon arcs and our concrete dams are just more sophisticated versions of Deucalion's wooden chest. This matters later because it's shifting our focus from the why to the how. How do we preserve the stone of our humanity when the environment itself becomes the enemy? The internal rot of this era is a strange mixture of hyper-awareness and total paralysis. We see the rain coming, we have the blueprints for the boat,
but we're still arguing about who gets the best cabin. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the world, the geography of power is continuing its slow, inexorable shift. The empires of the present are realizing that their wealth, built on the assumption of a stable horizon, is as fragile as a Greek palace. The logistics of the global economy are beginning to stutter as the ports flood and the breadbaskets dry out. This decision to wait for a divine sign or a technological miracle instead of acting on the evidence in the core is the recurring leadership disaster of our time. We are the heirs of Lycaon, serving a meal of business as usual while the clouds are already turning black. The records get strangely quiet here about the long-term plan. We have the data for the next 50 years, but we have almost nothing for the next 500. We have become a civilization of the short term, obsessed with the next quarter, the next election, the next update. The transition from a species that built cathedrals for centuries to a species that can't plan past a decade is the ultimate internal rot. We have lost the ability to think like the stone people who moved 5-ton blocks for a future they would never see. And while the storms become more frequent and the once-in-a-century floods happen every 3 years, the story of the flood is moving back into the center of our cultural psyche. It's no longer a metaphor, it's a mirror. We are looking at the wooden chest, the mud of Parnassus, and the stones of Pyrrha, and realizing that we are in the middle of our own myth. The transition to the final resolution of our story is no longer a distant possibility, it's the air we breathe. As we approach the twilight of this story, we must drift back to the heights of Olympus one last time. The transition from the physical archaeology of 2026 back to the divine perspective of the myth reveals the most uncomfortable truth of all. Zeus didn't flood the world because he was evil. He flooded it because he was a perfectionist who had lost his patience. The stone people were his attempt to create a version of humanity that was as durable as the mountains. Yet, as we've seen through the long, muddy trek of history, even stone erodes. Historians and mythologists debate whether the failure of the flood was Zeus's mistake or ours. In the final records of the Hellenistic scholars, there's a hint of divine regret. They imagined Zeus looking down at the world after the water receded and seeing that the new humans were just as flawed as the old ones. They were just harder to kill. This matters later because it explains the divine silence that followed. The gods stopped trying to fix us with water and started letting us fix ourselves with time. But that isn't the weirdest part. While we've been tracking the logistics of arcs and empires, we've ignored the internal rot of the gods themselves. Every culture we visited, from the Greeks to the Vikings to the Byzantines, eventually saw their gods fade into the background. The Byzantine ark became a museum, the Viking longship became a relic, the Silicon ark became a commodity. This decision to replace the sacred with the systemic is the ultimate transition of our species. We've traded the fear of Zeus for the fear of the quarterly report.
Meanwhile, elsewhere in the world, the actual environment is continuing to provide the feedback we've ignored for millennia. The Little Ice Age and the medieval warm period were just minor flickers compared to the scale of what we are witnessing now. The logistics of the modern world are being tested by the very thing they were designed to ignore, the volatility of a planet that is tired of being managed. This decision to prioritize efficiency over resilience is the final, recurring leadership disaster of our era. We are the architects of a world that is perfectly optimized for a climate that no longer exists. The records get strangely quiet here about the actual survival of our own stone legacy. We have built things out of concrete and steel that we hope will last for thousands of years, yet we are seeing them crumble in decades.
The internal rot is a lack of maintenance, not just of our bridges, but of our stories. We've forgotten that the flood myth wasn't just about water, it was about the social contract between the earth and those who walk upon it. And while the storms continue to gather and the sea levels continue to creep toward the marble steps of our modern palaces, the story of Deucalion and Pyrrha feels less like a myth and more like a mirror. We are looking at our own reflections in the rising water and realizing that the stone we were made from isn't as solid as we thought. The transition to the final resolution, the answer to why we tell these stories in the first place, is only a few moments away. The transition from the hyper-connected anxiety of the present to the quiet, long-term perspective of the earth is where we find our final historical waypoint. We've spent the last 3 hours drifting through the logistics of survival, from the wooden chests of Arcadia to the steel ironclads of London and the server farms of the Arctic. And through it all, a single repeating irony has emerged. We are obsessed with building arcs to save our things, but we always forget to save the thing that actually makes us stone people, our ability to recognize when we are the ones causing the rain. Historians and climatologists often point to the long pauses, those rare, quiet centuries between catastrophes, as the moments when civilization truly flourishes. But the myth of Zeus and the Great Flood suggests that these pauses are actually when the internal rot is at its most dangerous. In the quiet, we become arrogant. We stop checking the mortar in our dams. We stop listening to the stories of the people who lived through the last drowning. We become the Silver Age, serving a forbidden meal to a world that is already planning its next reset. But that isn't the weirdest part. As we look at the ruins of the civilizations that came before us, the Mycenaean citadels, the Roman aqueducts, the Viking longhouses, we see that they all left behind the same thing: debris. Not just physical debris, but psychological debris. They left us the story of the flood as a cultural inheritance, a warning label on the planet that we've spent 3,000 years trying to peel off. This matters later because we are the first generation that has the data to prove the myth was right, yet we are the ones struggling the most to believe it. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the world, the geography of the future is being decided by the movements of the water. The rising tides aren't just a physical threat, they're a logistical challenge to our concept of permanent borders. The stone of our national identities is being dissolved by the liquid reality of a global climate. This decision to cling to the old property lines while the ocean is moving the fences is the final, recurring dysfunction of our era. We are still arguing about the seating chart on a boat that hasn't even left the dock.
The records get strangely quiet here as we look toward the horizon. We've reached the edge of what we can know. The transition from the great after to whatever comes next is happening right now in the silent melting of the glaciers and the slow rising of the sea. We are the architects of the next myth. Thousands of years from now, will they tell stories of a Silicon Age where people were turned into data points before the Great Fire or the Great Flood took their cities? Will they find our plastic trinkets and wonder if we were giants or just children playing with toys we didn't understand? And while the world outside your window remains hopefully quiet for now, the heavy rhythm of the rain in our history continues to beat. It's a sound that connects us back to Deucalion, back to the ice people of the north, and back to the priests of the Nile. We are all survivors of a story that hasn't quite ended yet. The final part, the true resolution, and the reason why any of this matters, is waiting just around the corner.
And so we arrive at the end of our 3-hour trek through the damp corridors of human memory. The transition from the high-tech anxieties of 2026 to this final moment of reflection is the most important one of all. We've watched the world drown in Greek myths, Viking blood, and Roman neglect. We've seen the stone people rebuild their citadels in every era, always convinced that their version of the Ark was the one that would finally hold back the tide. Historians debate many things, but the one thing they all agree on is that every empire we've discussed, from the Mycenaeans to the Victorians, believed they were living at the end of history. They all thought they were the final, perfected model. The irony, of course, is that they were all just layers of silt waiting to be discovered by the next generation of survivors. The Great Flood isn't a single event in the past. It's a recurring character. It's the planet's way of asking us if we've learned anything about the weight of our own pride. But that isn't the weirdest part. The answer to the mystery, the question of why we keep telling this story, isn't about survival logistics or divine punishment. It's about the stones. Remember Deucalion and Pyrrha standing on the muddy slopes of Mount Parnassus, throwing the bones of their mother behind them? They didn't just create people, they created a connection. Those stones represent the hard, unyielding parts of us that refuse to give up, even when the horizon has disappeared. We tell the story of the flood because it's the only way we know how to admit that we are fragile, while simultaneously promising ourselves that we are durable. The final reveal of our journey is that the flood never actually ended. It just changed its form. It became the scourge of the Vikings, the darkness of the Middle Ages, the smoke of the Industrial Age, and the data of our own time. The internal rot of every civilization we visited was always the same, a belief that we could separate ourselves from the earth. But as the stone people eventually learned, you can't throw the bones of your mother away without eventually becoming part of the earth yourself. This decision to see ourselves as part of the cycle rather than the masters of it is the lesson that still applies today. It's the only plan that actually works. We don't need a bigger boat. We need a better social contract with the rain. We need to remember that the great after is only as good as the integrity of the people who build it. And that's how the empire ended. Not loudly, but slowly. As the lights stay low and the world outside remains quiet, I hope you found some comfort in these ancient mistakes. History is a long, slow conversation, and tonight you were part of it. The rain has finally stopped, the mud is starting to dry, and the stones are waiting to see what you'll build next. Now let your mind drift. You've earned the sleep.